Let's just wait for Trang to join us, and then we can start. Hi, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, depending on where you are, and hope you are well. And welcome to the Special Policy Talk or Spot. For today, we will be discussing the topic of reshaping cities in the post-COVID-19 world. As we all know, cities are on the front line of this COVID-19 crisis, with economic activities dwindling, high rates of infection, lots of deaths in cities, and also inadequate resources. We know that as cities accommodate over half of the world's population, long-standing inequalities have even deepened during this pandemic. Today in cities, urban dwellers working in informal sector and often holding on to precarious jobs are joining the swelling ranks of the unemployed. And a key lessons from this pandemic is that sustainable and resilient cities are actually doing much better managing the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic than the others. Hence, this webinar will try to answer the question, what is the role of cities in battling the COVID-19 impact? How can cities play the role as job generators and also the engine of growth? And what is the role of the private sector to help transform cities in post-COVID-19 world? So to answer these big questions, so we have our distinguished colleagues from the ERCD, from SERD, SDCC, and OPPP to share their knowledge and expertise. So let me introduce them one by one. So ladies first. First, we have from SERD, Ms. Dang Thuy Trang. Ms. Trang is a senior urban specialist in the Urban Development and Water Division of SERD. She has been working on urban planning and urban development, water resource management, solid waste management, biodiversity conservation, and community-based forage management in Southeast Asia for over 15 years. She holds a master's degree in environmental management from the NUS and also a master's degree in urban planning and policy design from Polytechnique di Milano. Second, we have our colleague from ERCD, Yi Jiang. Yi Jiang is principal economist at the Economic Analysis and Operations Support Divisions of the ERCD. His research interests include public economics, urban transport economics, and development economics. He also worked in the East Asia Department of ADB over 4 years on policy advisory projects. He is also the lead author of one of the ADO team chapter on cities. He holds a PhD degree in economics from the University of Maryland. Third, we have Arghya Sinha Roy, who is a principal climate change specialist from SDCC. He is involved in supporting and designing and implementing various investment projects and technical assistance related to urban resilience, infrastructure resilience, community resilience, and post-disaster recovery and reconstruction. Last but not the least, we have Sanjay from OPPP. Sanjay brings over 20 years of urban planning and PPP policy and transactional experience and has been closely working with cities in the US and in Asia, both on the buy and on the sell side. At the PPP thematic group secretariat, Sanjay is leading the creation of Investable Cities initiative to help cities in Asia Pacific improve their competitiveness and resilience as they build back better from the COVID-19 pandemics. So, first, let me invite Yi Jiang to share his views about, even prior to the pandemic, what has been the trend, Yi, in terms of urbanization in developing Asia, and how do cities contribute to economic growth and job creation?
Thank you, James. To your questions, basically we have the answers in the ADO theme chapter you just mentioned. Based on the data of UN, the number of the developing Asia has been urbanizing quite rapidly. The number of urban inhabitants in the region has increased from 375 million in 1970 to 1.8 billion in 2017, which means 3.4% per annum as growth rate. The urbanization rate is projected to rise from 46% in 2017 to 64% by 2050. So about 2/3 of people will live in city by 2050 in developing Asia. We also develop data on our own, which we call natural city data. So we find a pretty much similar growth rate for city urban populations in this region. Moreover, the data allow us to look at the geographical coverage or spatial coverage of cities. We find that actually the urban area expanded even faster than the population growth. So from 2000 to 2016, the urban area in developing Asia has expanded by almost 5% each year. So this is the overall trend of urbanization in the region. However, there are significant heterogeneity exists, as some cities have grown faster than others, and some cities in the region even shrunk in population and area. Another feature we find is that cities expand beyond the administrative boundaries, and they form clusters. So that means there's limitation to define city based on administrative boundary. We really need to look at the actual spatial shapes of the cities. There are other interesting patterns regarding urbanization in Asia in our report. So in terms of contribution of cities to the economy, to the economic development and the growth, so the central economic finding is the bigger and the denser cities are more productive. There are theoretical and empirical explanation to it. Basically, cities allow firms and the workers to match, to have better matching, to have higher productivities, and they can also share infrastructure, sharing resources. And moreover, people can communicate more effectively. So there are innovation created during this communication between people. However, in developing countries, cities also face challenges. If cities want to maximize their effects or their contribution to the economy, they really need to solve a number of issues, which include say affordable housing, low mobility due to congestion, also air pollution, which causes significant public health risk. Of course, the pandemic also remind us city faces high health risk, which we all need to deal with in the future urbanization. Probably let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Yi. Let me now turn on to Trang. Trang, the question that I have for you is, with our experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, what are the top challenges for urban cities? And what do you think are some of the measures that are helpful to address some of these challenges and to reshape cities in the post-COVID-19 world?
Thank you so much, James, and good afternoon, morning, evening, colleagues. Thanks for joining today. To your question, the first question about the challenges that cities in our DMCs at least have been facing during the COVID-19. So as you know, 90% of the COVID cases are occurring in urban areas for obvious reason. You know, the high density, the interactions that we have within a city. And therefore, the impacts of COVID-19 are felt very strongly by the residents of cities. So with this, at the corporate level, ADB has issued a guidance notes for livable cities post-COVID-19 new normal, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. So based on this, we are looking at the major challenges in the cities during COVID, and we found that many of these challenges are not new. They were always there, right? With the cities, I think you mentioned that a little bit, but it's just COVID that have really aggravated these issues. So I'll just summarize. There might 5 points. The first one has to do with the fact that different groups are experiencing the impacts of COVID differently. So obviously they are a part of the population that's much more vulnerable. That's the people who are living in, for example, informal settlements or slums, people who are living in very high density areas with not enough facilities for water supply, sanitation, hygiene facilities, and that's very important for us to think about. The second point has to do with the urban infrastructure and services. So again, before COVID, in many of our DMC cities, the services, urban services like water, sanitation, waste management, is inadequate. But this has become even more severe during COVID. And there's also the social infrastructure part of it. Affordable housing, for example, healthcare, education facilities are even more severe during COVID. The third point has to do with the inadequate ICT systems. Many of the cities do not have adequate ICT systems. And this also leads to the incomplete information that people receive. There's a lot of fake news, that can cause a lot of anxiety and panic reactions. For example, you see, people picking up or emptying shelves in supermarkets. That's one of the cause. The fourth point, and that's on the news every day, this is as much a health crisis as it is an economic crisis. It's felt strongly by many of the enterprises, by the cities. Cities' revenues are lower. They have less taxes. In some of the cities where we work, one of the major industries is tourism. And with COVID, there's no tourists, so that is felt very strongly by cities. And at the same time, they have higher expenses to cope with COVID. And the last point has to do with just the local government's capacity to deal with this. They are just overwhelmed. I mean, in Bago City, where I work with, for example, the number of emergency response meetings that the mayor and his staff has to go to every day is incredible. So their resources are now diverted to deal with COVID, and that's the fifth point that we have found. So with all of these challenges, your next question is a hard one, right? What have we do? What can we do to address it? My answer is simple. There is nothing that is outside of the ADB strategy, the OP4 for operational priority for livable cities. Nothing that's outside the framework, but there are some elements that have just become a lot more important that we have to address. So under that same framework, we look at urban services, we look at urban planning, financial sustainability, we look at the urban environment, the climate resilience. So for example, under urban services, I will go back to what I was talking about with water supply, sanitation and hygiene facilities, ensuring that the services can continue to be delivered during COVID. And we see amazingly in many cities that continues, but that also, the COVID is a reminder for us to look at these utilities and the agencies responsible for the services so that they can absorb these shocks during COVID or during other crises. Under urban planning, we are learning that we need to look at the way that public spaces are used for COVID, for example. And then under the environmental sustainable cities is not different from what we've been doing. We need to make sure that our lakes and rivers and oceans are clean. And that relates to two very important points during COVID. How do we manage solid waste and medical waste? This is becoming a bigger issue, and we need to address that firmly. So James, I have a small video of what we're doing more concretely. So what I was talking about was more at a corporate level, but we're doing a small project with the Department of Tourism in Baguio City in the Philippines. If we have time, could we just play that 2-minute video to show the participants here some of the experience we've got? Thank you.
Hannah, can you play the short video of Trong?
The Philippine government is fighting the effects of COVID-19 in multiple ways. Some sectors like tourism, along with local governments, are using new technologies to be more resilient, while assisting communities in coping with the impact of the pandemic. Tourism employs 5.7 million Filipinos and contributes 12.7% to the country's GDP.
Tourism is really a key pillar of our economy, with vital contributions in terms of productivity and employment generation.
In the first half of 2020, foreign tourist visits dropped by almost 70% against a year ago due to the pandemic. To regain foreign visitors' confidence, the Department of Tourism is adopting digital solutions to protect the health and safety of tourists.
We've launched a few digital platforms to entice people to visit again once it is possible. We have the Wake Up in the Philippines digital campaign featuring the wide spectrum of tourist attractions we have to offer in all 16 of our regions. The biggest change we are implementing in the tourism industry is the mandatory compliance of tourism establishments to the new normal safety and health protocols and guidelines. Digital solutions will definitely come into play given that the trend is now to go contactless. Now more than ever, cashless transactions are no longer a plus, but it is a necessity.
Baguio City, a popular tourist destination in the northern Philippines, is one of the cities heavily affected by COVID-19.
Our tourist arrivals, last year, we generated around 540,000 tourists. Comparing it to this year, about 70,000 tourists. So we're really hurting.
Baguio City aims to become a smart and sustainable city. It is using new technology to improve its resilience and deliver basic services during the pandemic and future crises.
We're pursuing our smart city system. It will be the first smart city system in the Philippines. It is something that we're proud of because we came up with this contact tracing methodology. It has actually 3 components. One is the data collection tool. Every time our contact tracers goes out, all they have to do is use their mobile devices and their tablets to put in and code the information that they were able to gather, and it goes to a cloud. Second is the GIS platform, which we use for geospatial analysis and determine the extent of potential infection in one particular area. And finally, the link analysis. It establishes patterns, trends, and relationships and networks so that there's deeper analysis every time we look at one particular case.
The Asian Development Bank acts as a catalyst in the process of developing sustainable tourism destinations in the Philippines, including the city of Baguio. The ASEAN-Australia Smart Cities Trust Fund will be able to support cities across Asia in developing digital solutions. The trust fund is supported by the Australian government.
Maybe Hannah, we can. Yes, finished. So let me now invite Sanjay. My question to Sanjay. Sanjay, are you there?
Yes, thank you, James.
Yes, Sanjay, my question is also on the COVID-19 impact on cities. And what do you think is what's the COVID-19 impact on cities, specifically on the private sector? And what can the private sector do to reshape the cities and to make it better in the post-COVID-19 world?
Thanks, James. Thanks for inviting me to this discussion here. As many of you know, I'm leading this initiative called Creating Investable Cities to help Asian cities think more through their resilience and competitiveness as we come back from COVID-19. And a lot of the points raised here go very closely to what Chang just mentioned. But if I could quickly share a slide to help talk through where we see the challenges as we move forward. Do let me know if you can see my slide, James.
Yes. Do you want to put it in presentation mode?
I think this is fine if people can read it.
Okay, yes, it's readable. Yep.
Terrific. To us, I mean, COVID-19 actually, it's exposed every weakness of the city and kind of showed how frail the competitiveness is. I mean, the efficiency of a city comes from three factors, right? I mean, it's the ability to efficiently provide jobs so that we all learn from each other. We actually build on these jobs and do more, create more jobs. The ability to efficiently provide housing, and the ability to provide all the services in between the jobs and the housing that we need to have a livable, proper life. And it hasn't spared any one of these components. So let's look at jobs. I mean, many of the cities in Asia Pacific are just so focused on one sector per se. Tourism was highlighted just now, that it becomes so important for us as we go forward to start thinking about diversifying our economies so that we can actually do more and be more resilient when something like this comes up. On housing, I mean, the issues of social housing have been brought to the center. I mean, a huge light has been shown on this as we look forward in terms of the ability or need to provide social housing and other social services as we go forward. I mean, when you start thinking about the role of the private sector, almost 90% of the PPPs that take place in the developed world, in the OECD countries, are focused on social infrastructure, on health, education, and the like. And here, in Asia, it's less than 5%. So there's a huge gap that the private sector can fill in. But to do that, I think the thing that's at the heart of this is our cities need improved governance as we go forward to be able to attract that private sector. And COVID-19 has actually highlighted this ability of our cities as well. I mean, a lot of this demand that cities or a lot of the services that cities provide are inelastic. I mean, it's water, wastewater, education, health, housing, things that our cities can't live without, I mean, or our residents can't live without. And it's put tremendous burdens on improving our governance as we go forward, or our ability of our cities or our leaders to be able to meet this need as we look forward. And for us, this is a terrific opportunity actually to help these cities holistically as we move forward, so that we're not only looking at the infrastructure, but also the governance and the financing of these cities as we move forward, because it's here. And I think it's a terrific opportunity for us to bring the private sector in as we move forward. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Sanjay. That's really that framework of jobs, services, housing also resonates with what Yi mentioned earlier in terms of some of the challenges for Asian cities in terms of congestion, housing, and even the impact of the pandemic. Let me now invite Argya. Argya, my main question to Argya is something similar. From the point of view of urban development and climate change and disaster risk management, how did COVID-19 affected the urban cities in Asia? And what will be your recommendations in terms of reshaping cities in the future so that it becomes a little bit more resilient, particularly from this explosion of pandemic or other natural or man-made disasters?
Thank you, James, and very good afternoon, everybody, and very happy to join this discussion. From a climate and disaster risk angle, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has been a stark early reminder of three things. Firstly, the very fact that climate and disaster risk will not wait for the pandemic to get over. We have seen this in last 1 year, where many urban areas, whether in the Pacific countries or in South Asia like Bangladesh and India, has been devastated by terrific impacts of cyclones. So I think cities recognize that moving forward, we can expect to see more of these compound hazards, where you have a natural hazard compounded by a health emergency or other types of emergencies coming together. And one needs to prepare for such compound hazard and risk more systematically. Cities also have recognized the importance of some of the slow onset hazards like extreme heat stress, which many parts of Asia, specifically South Asia and Southeast Asia, faces. And I think that kind of understanding of risk at a more compound hazard level is key. The second is, I think we recognize nowadays that cities may face risk which doesn't originate in the cities itself. At the same time, sometimes actions that cities take might lead to risk in other areas. And I think this systemic nature of risk, it becomes very critical for cities to understand, because it helps them identify measures that can build resilience. For example, I mean, we often think living in urban areas, we don't have to think about food systems and food security because the rural areas are resilient. But as we are clearly seeing, that's not the case. So moving forward, cities also need to think about food security through urban agriculture solutions, because in order for them to be more resilient. And I think third, another key aspect, and Trang and others also talked about it, in Asia Pacific region, I think cities recognize that in order to build resilience, we need to embrace informality. And this about informal settlements and informal economy is a critical characteristic of urban cities. And thus, it's important that we really try to understand and address the underlying drivers of vulnerability, be it access to land or social housing, as Sanjay mentioned, or access to early warning information or livelihood opportunities. All of this actually compound and essentially contribute to risk. So for me, the three key factors are for cities to look at the compound hazards, systemic nature of risk, and to embrace informality. Now, if you want to turn that around into more kind of policy recommendations, what cities could do moving forward, I think the first and foremost is to embrace the issue of risk-informed development, where risk is not just to protect your assets or infrastructure. Understanding of risk is equally about understanding how to steer growth, which every city would want to do. So whether you're using risk information in spatial or land use planning and land use management processes, or in decisions on housing or decisions on labor market, policies, etc., that is critical. So risk-informed development is the first point. The second point, I think, is important of strengthening partnership. And we have seen in the pandemic that cities that have very well organized citizens and community groups have actually survived quite well. So this importance of strengthening partnership with both local communities as well as with the private sector becomes critical for moving forward in terms of resilience aspect. And last but not the least, in the context of pro-poor solutions and solutions that embraces informality, I think we need to take a very hard-nosed approach over here to recognize that if we talk about resilience, we need to move beyond infrastructure solutions and talk about solutions in the context of social development and human development, which is absolutely critical to improve the well-being of the poorest population. So we need to see more of social protection programs which are targeted at the urban poor and which are adaptive and shock responsive. We need to look at more housing microfinance for pro-poor households. We need to look at public infrastructure, which looks at specifically city vendors and how you can protect them from heat stresses or extreme heat events. We need to look at more of livelihood opportunities for the poorest population. So I think these three aspects of risk-informed development, embracing informality, and last but not the least, strengthening partnership with local communities and private sector becomes critical if cities want to become resilient to a range of shocks and stresses in the future. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Arge. And I'll come back to you in terms of managing the risk that arise from the informality, compounding risk, as well as spillover effect. Yi, can I go back to you and ask the question? During your presentation, you mentioned that one of the findings of the ADO theme chapter is that bigger and dense cities are actually better because they are more productive, they do better matching, they have better communications. After the COVID experience, do you still think that bigger and denser cities is the way to go for the future? Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm a believer in cities. I don't think it's a problem that the city is too big or too dense that this COVID gets serious. I think there are many other factors working together to determine how bad the situation is, or how reasonably good the situation is in a city. So I think the benefits bigger city, denser city bring us still outweigh the potential costs or risks we are facing. So I think there's, of course, there are many things cities, especially cities in developing countries, can do to properly handle future risks like COVID.
Yeah, because what I noticed is, like, for example, here in Australia, there is a move towards developing secondary and tertiary cities, because what they realize is that as the cities become bigger and denser, then the issues related to public bads, related to housing congestion, air pollution, crime, and even easy transmission of pandemic becomes a critical issue. That's why they're saying that, well, maybe you really need to break down the bigger and denser cities and develop more secondary cities to address that concentration risk arising from the big and dense cities. What do you think about that view of managing the risk from future pandemic?
Well, I appreciate this this view. Even beyond the health concern, from economic perspective, there are also pros and cons for developing different cities of different sizes. So they are studying looking at whether big city or small city help more in terms of rural poverty reduction. And the results found in India is that secondary cities may be more growth of secondary cities help to reduce the rural poverty more than the largest cities. So I think in developing country, we do observe some cities are really big and probably exceed the capacities, and it's quite dense. So I should say there's good density and a bad density. So it depends on many other factors to decide whether the density is good or bad, and maybe there's some limit on the density. But we should not just conclude that any density is bad. So probably we should, I think we should still promote certain densities, and at the same time try to contain the negative side of the density in developing countries.
Thank you. Well said, Ji. Tram, may I go back to you? You've mentioned that one of the challenge of cities in managing COVID impact really is financial sustainability. And I agree with you. If you look at the increasing health expenditure, the need to supply the population with vaccine, the need increasing social assistance, and then low tourism and low taxes for business. How do we see cities are addressing this fiscal sustainability with COVID in the future? Is there a need to reform the sharing of taxes between the national government and local government? Trang? I think you're muted.
Sorry, thanks for that. Thanks James, for the question. I like to drill down on the one thing that we know in SCUW, working with utilities and agencies responsible for, again, basic urban services. So in all our projects, we look at the financial sustainability of a utility, right? That's essential. Whether you provide the water supply or sanitation or solid waste management services, you need to make sure that that agency has enough financial resources so that they can continue to provide these services. And that's done across the project, right? Economic and financial analysis. But now with COVID, we realize on top of that, there will be shocks. There will be times when people will not be able to pay for the services for a few months. How would a utility work on it? Do they have the money to look at it? So it just suddenly adds another layer of complexity in the way that we look at financial analysis in our projects. So I'll just say it as an example of how we need to look at it. Going back to that specific point you said about the taxes between national and local governments, indeed, I think resources should be pooled so that they can be used for priorities. And at the end of the day, there is no city, there's no country that's doing well without their cities doing well. That's across the board. So I think emphasis and priorities should be then be given to the cities and to the people that are more vulnerable. Thanks.
Thank you, Trang. Well said. Sanjay, can I go back to you? You mentioned the role of private sector in rebuilding cities. One question that I have for you, Sanjay, is the role of NSOs. As you all know, I'm sure in Metro Manila, there was a young lady who really started a program of putting up pantries, pantries for the community, providing food, and it's basically based on donations. So what I'm thinking is, when we say private sector, we usually think of big business, right? But I'm thinking that the other side of the private sector really is civil society, national people, ordinary people, especially in the pandemic, where the main needs of people in terms of medicine, food, are really in large amounts, very, very short. So what do you think is the role of civil society in rebuilding more resilient cities in the future?
Thanks, Jim. That's a very interesting question, and I have a tremendous amount of experience working back in planning in the US, and as I've come here and started working closer with the cities here, some of the things that even Argo just raised actually come to mind, and that is, how close are we to the planning that actually happens and the participatory level that happens in planning in our communities here? And the answer is not very. We really have to get closer to where we provide infrastructure. And in the urban area, I think that is at the heart of it. The initiative that SCUW is running on smart cities, to me, is phenomenal from the perspective of being able to get closer to the community in terms of being able to generate data, generate responses, get community involvement and things at that level. Again, this is not addressing the private sector participation of it, but frankly, at this point in our cities, I think smart city infrastructure is about the easiest things to get the private sector in. It really is something which actually will be, the turnaround time is quicker, the impact is higher, the costs are lower of being able to bring something like this in. So the private sector and the efficiencies are obvious of something like this. This is an area where we should actually be thinking about private sector participation. The informality that Argo raises, it's a very critical point. I mean, our cities have not embraced informality, not in housing, not in the jobs we do, but the biggest resource that our cities have, and it's comparable to any part of the world, is a land. And how well are we able to capitalize or monetize that land to be able to provide resources back? It's something which the private sector can play a much bigger role at. in terms of improving the infrastructure that we provide for our future. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sanjay. Now let me invite the participants to raise questions. I think Ramesh has posted one question, and I'll invite any of the panelists to respond to Ramesh's question. Let me read it. Learning from the pandemic, how can ADB's urban work be more integrated across different sectors? I think this is actually a very important point, because you've raised that there are so many issues in cities that are really affected by COVID, but now how do we respond in an integrated manner as ADB? So Argil, do you want to take the first shot?
Sure, thank you. I think that's a very important question. I will talk from a climate resilience angle. We have been doing some work in Indonesia trying to look at resilience and urban poverty. And when we started the work, we recognized the importance of social protection programs for the poor. But the more you go in depth, you recognize social protection programs are largely designed for rural population and not so much for the urban population. Now, if we think that in the future, urban areas will face more risk, like shocks and stresses from climate change and disaster risk, that means these social protection systems have to have certain level of agility or shock responsive features for them to better respond to such shocks. And these shocks in a rural area is very different from an urban area, which means a significant new way is required, the way we design social protection programs, which can benefit the urban poor. This means that when we are developing an urban development project, we do need to work across with colleagues working in the social sectors to bring social protection as an important aspect of building resilience of the urban poor. The same example actually holds true also for urban agriculture, which we think moving forward will be an important aspect to look in urban areas of food security point of view. And there across this crossover between urban development, which focuses on urban infrastructure and urban planning issues and landscape management, and how do you tie up with the urban agriculture, which look in the rural issues, together. So we really hope that from a resilience perspective, this interlinkages between sectors, but also across administrative level becomes more and more critical if we are to take forward some of the solutions in a much more sustainable manner. Thank you.
Any other response from our other panelists?
Maybe I can try. So I think from this pandemic, we learned that the capacity of local governments play a critical role in terms of tracing people and getting people quarantined, affected people quarantined, then providing vaccination. So this capacity of city government is really important. I think in normal time, this local government capacity is also important in terms of urban development. We actually emphasize this in our ADO theme chapter. So the capacity of government is necessary for to do the proper planning for the city, providing public goods, managing the public assets, and controlling negative externalities such as air pollution. This is during normal time. Then during pandemic, I think this capacity play a bigger role. It will help greatly to reduce health costs. Well, in theory, contagious disease is another negative externality. So yeah, so the government capacity in reducing negative externality is critical. So I think this is also could be cross-cutting issue, and maybe ADB could invest more in building government's capacity. Thank you.
I think that's one message that's coming very strong in this discussion is the important role of planning and capacity building in managing these challenges that's come about because of the pandemic. I'm now inviting Trang. Yes, please feel free to respond to Ramesh's question.
Thank you. Thanks, Ramesh, for the question. I like the fact that you call it urban work and not urban sector, because I think the moment that urban is still considered a sector, and that in itself, I think it is an issue. For us, urban is a space in which we work, and there have to be so many other interventions. So going back to the discussion of resilient city, for me, the resiliency of a city is defined by the knowledge, by the resources, financial or physical resources that the city has, by the technical capacity, and most importantly, by the governance structure that the city has that allows its citizens to participate and to support the city's visions and decisions. So when we come into a city discussing a potential ADB support, I think that's what we need to have in mind, rather than coming with the question of do you need help in transport, or do you need help in waste or in water, because the moment that is the approach, and I think we are again compartmentalizing the interventions that we have to look first at the systems and the structure that the city government has, and then address it from that point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Sanjay?
Sorry, James, for taking so much time, but this is such an interesting question. From our perspective, I think, and going back to what Chang also mentioned about urban being a space rather than a sector and having to work across different factors, I think it's very important that we build the capacity, as Zhang said. But till we do that, it's very important that we as ADB get involved with helping work closely with cities to help get that capacity there. And what I mean by that also is we bring a lot of resources as a bank to help our cities, but being able to look at it cross-thematically or cross-sectorally is quite important to be able to mobilize more resources, to be able to target our interventions much better. And so from that perspective, I mean, getting into that early stage planning of before a project, I mean, by the time a project comes into us as a wastewater project, it's a little too late already. I think we have to do much more upfront to be able to make sure that the project hits those aspects of resilience, of gender, and all those things before it's ingrained and sent to the solid waste management department or the solid waste management project. I'll stop there.
One question I have for all the panelists. If we are looking back at the COVID-19 experience of cities, can you name one or two cities that has really done well? And what do you think are the key to the success of that city in managing the health impact of the pandemic as well as managing the economy? And then in contrast, do you know of a city which has really done poorly? And what was the reason for that poor performance? Because maybe by providing live examples of how different cities have coped with the pandemic, we can actually identify some good practices. Anybody who has really looked into this issue? Sanjay, you still have your hands raised.
I'm sorry, that was the old hand.
Yes.
But since I have the mic, just for a second, Tel Aviv in Israel actually did a terrific job in turning around in terms of how quickly they moved the government from to a work from home status at the early parts of COVID-19. It took them almost 2 weeks to actually make that shift of something that they had planned almost a year for, of how they would actually build in the freedom to work from where you would down the line. What they thought would take a year for the whole government to move and shift to that level, they actually did it in a couple of weeks when COVID-19 hit. I'll just stop there.
Okay.
As an example.
Any thought from the other panelists?
Could I try, James?
Yes, Trang, feel free.
Thanks. I wish I could say Ho Chi Minh, which is my hometown, but unfortunately they did very well at first, and then things didn't go so well for them. I think Singapore has done pretty well from the beginning, when again going back to vulnerability of certain groups, they didn't go so well with certain workers, the dormitories of workers, but they also have turned it around. And I think that has to do with the ability to plan in advance. They are building vaccine manufacturer facilities now, but that discussion about vaccines happened 3 years before COVID time. So the ability to plan and to foresee certain shocks that could happen to a country or a city comes from leaders. So I can't emphasize enough the planning aspect of things, foresee things, going back to, I think, to Ogo's point about risk-informed decisions. Thanks.
We still have, to the audience, we still have 8 minutes. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise it to our experts. Arya?
Can I add,
Yes.
James, a question? Yes, I don't have a specific city, but I think it goes back to what he was saying about heterogeneity in a city, and we need to recognize that. So if you ask me, I've been here in Manila for the last 1.5 years. In my neighborhood, I didn't face any problem, to be honest about it. So I would assume my local government unit in my neighborhood has handled it very well. But this may not be the case in the entire city. So I think it very much boils down to the local level. And as Trang was saying, what kind of forward-looking planning measures are in place? How organized is your communities in your local neighborhoods to face these shocks and stresses? And we need to look at this from a very angle of heterogeneity, because cities are not homogeneous, and there are pockets of cities which are affluent than the others. And accordingly, the opportunities and resources available are also very different. So I think it's important for us to factor that in this question. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? One, two, three. I think we still have about 7 minutes. What I'll do is I'll ask Hannah to play one video. Hannah, can you play the video on smart cities? Because I think there are also some good messages from there, while probably some of our participants are still thinking about questions. Hannah, can you play the last video?
Ever wonder what future cities will be like? What if they could think like a human brain? Imagine a city where layers of artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things are being incorporated into our infrastructures, making even homes and traffic monitoring systems talk to each other.
Hi, I'm Sarah Lamptey, and I'm here with Mike Pitts to talk about future cities. So what can we expect?
Well, the city of the future will have a lot more walking and cycling space, a lot less pollution, and that will allow people to live much more healthy and active lives.
Fantastic. So what will make that possible?
The systems that manage a city will be much more controlled by artificial intelligence, but also will be using a lot more green energy. So say if you work in an office, the building itself will be optimized for the occupants, but it'll also communicate with other buildings and will generate its own energy using things like solar windows.
Sounds good. So what about on my lunch break?
So you'll go and collect your lunch from what's an increasingly interactive high street. You probably won't have a till in a shop when you pick up your sandwich, but if you went to go and buy a new dress, you'd go into an augmented reality changing room where you could look at different options and how they looked on you.
I like the sound of that. So what about on my way home?
Well, we won't be driving cars so much in the future. The public transport will be almost Uber-like. You'll have automatic driven pods that will come up and collect you.
So you're saying that transport will become intelligent?
Absolutely. Particularly moving between different transport modes will become even easier and all seamless and connected.
So how would I pay for something like that?
You just hop on and off. The vehicle would sense that you've changed modes and will charge you accordingly.
That sounds really convenient.
Exactly, and also these pods will start to deliver things like goods and services to you when they're not moving people around.
Okay, so all that automation and smart technology isn't bad for jobs?
Oh, quite the contrary. What they'll do is free up people to spend more time doing the human interactive parts. It's automating the routine bits. So imagine a nurse being able to spend more time with the patients, or a police officer being able to spend more time on the beat interacting with the public.
So future cities look smart, green and exciting and will lead healthier lives and then have more time to enjoy them. So what do you think?
So one question from this video for the panelists is, have we seen any cross-cutting technology that's being used in cities to manage the effect of the pandemic? Anyone from the panelists?
James,
Sanjay?
apologies. Could you repeat the question?
So basically the video was saying that the use of technology in making our lives better. Are there any cross-cutting technology that was rolled out in cities as because of our experience of the pandemic? Bernard, surveillance camera. Surveillance camera everywhere. I think one technology that I still don't know, it was rolled out heavily, was the use of QR code. Although here in Australia, when we look at our experience of contact tracing, most of the contact tracing that were actually based on actual case interviews rather than the use of the QR code. So I'm not sure whether the rollout of QR codes, we've been scanning QR codes, has actually contributed to actual contact tracing of COVID cases in cities. That's one thing that I still don't know, because one example in Australia is there was criticism of the system, because what they found out when they evaluated the use of this QR code is that most of the contact tracing are still based on the standardized interview of patients. There is another question from the chat box. Anyone who wants to answer that? From Joris, do you want to ask your question to the panelists? We still have a minute. With that, if there's no more question, I'll invite the panelists to come up with a 1-minute closing statement before we end. So can I ask Trump to deliver your closing statement? 1 minute, just a rapid closing statement.
Thank you, James. Briefly, I think COVID-19 is a reminder for us to think about those who are less fortunate than we are as ADB. And because of that reminder, I think resilient cities, first and foremost, have to be inclusive cities. I think that's key. And the last point I want to make is that COVID should be also an opportunity for us to look at new innovation, use of technologies, and speed up that process to apply technologies. Thank you.
Sanjay, 1-minute closing statement.
Thank you, James. And from my end, thank you so much for inviting OPPP into this discussion with SERD. This really is a terrific platform for us to think together as one ADB, how we move forward. If I were to quickly answer Joris's question, yes, Joris, many of our cities have faced serious challenges of underinvestment, and yeah, sovereign support for building pipes or treatment plants will continue to remain the focus in many of our cities. But for those cities, and this to me is the cities which are at the higher end in each country, who are financially sustainable by themselves, who depend lesser on intergovernmental transfers, there is an opportunity actually for us to also help them to move to the next level. And there, I think the focus is not as much on pipes and treatment plants, but much more on better governance, much more integrated facilities, much more thinking about how they can do land use and transport together, how they can bring in resilience, gender, and all these other aspects in. And that's where I think some of these shifts will also happen as we go forward. I'll stop there.
Last closing statement. Jiang, do you want to deliver your closing statement? Or Argia?
Sure, thanks, James. So I think from my perspective, this will certainly not be the last crisis that the cities are going to face, and they can expect more crises in the future. And as a result, they should really look at the recovery process from COVID-19 as an opportunity to course correct and put in place systems, give enough emphasis to planning, engagement of citizens, and much more upstream, understanding of system level issues, which will put them in a longer term resilient pathway. And this is absolutely critical moving forward. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Last but not the least, I'm calling on Jiang to deliver his closing statement. Jiang, are you still there? So maybe Jiang is not connected anymore. But with that, folks, thank you very much for attending the spot on Reshaping Cities for the Future. And we hope you've learned a lot. And we will also produce a snapshot for this spot, which we will circulate after about a week. So thank you, everyone.